안녕하십니까? 포스트 코로나19 시대 아시아 의약품 및 백신 접근성 현황과 개선 방안 포럼에 오신 것을 환영합니다. 저희는 휴먼 아시아 한국인권학회와 함께 오늘의 공동 주최 단체 중 하나인 UAM 코리아의 김가은, 김진영입니다.
오늘 참석해주신 모든 분들께 감사드립니다. 온라인으로 참석하시는 경우 화면 하단의 번역 버튼을 통해서 한국어 또는 영어를 선택하실 수 있습니다. 포럼의 온라인 자료는 www.humanasia.org에서 확인하실 수 있습니다. 또한 행사 진행 중 2021 forum@humanasia.org로 질문을 보내주시면 각 세션의 Q&A에서 답변 드릴 예정입니다.
그럼 휴먼 아시아 대표이시자 UN 시민적 정치적 권리위원이신 고려대학교 국제대학원 서창록 교수님의 개사와 함께 포럼을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 서창록 대표님, 무대로 모시겠습니다.
Thank you very much. Distinguished guests and participants, good morning. It's my great honor to welcome you all to today's forum entitled Beyond COVID-19 Access to Medicines and Vaccines in Asia. My name is Changnok So. I'm a president of Human Asia and professor at Korea University. Today's event is organized by Human Asia and UAEM Korea, and I'm happy that we were able to co-host this event with the Korean Association of Human Rights Studies. Over the past 70 years, South Korea has transformed itself from aid recipient to aid donor. Domestic health outcomes have improved dramatically, with South Korea achieving universal health coverage in 1989. The Korean pharmaceutical market likewise has rapidly grown. After initially being based on locally produced generic medicines, our pharmaceutical industry is now transitioning into an R&D-centered model. These new innovative developments in the biomedical field not only generate further economic growth for Korea, but should additionally result in more lives across the world being saved and enhanced. This has perhaps become increasingly evident as Korean biopharmaceutical companies progress on their COVID-19 treatment and vaccine development. Yet, multiple challenges remain regarding our right to health. Today, many patients in Asia will face barriers in accessing the medicines they urgently require. Unmerited granting of intellectual property, for instance, is blocking the introduction of new drugs and vaccines for life-threatening diseases that can be affordably priced. For some patients, high out-of-pocket payments for medicines result in unmet needs or cause devastating financial hardship. Others simply cannot access the drugs for the illnesses within their own national borders. This focus on profit-making over people negates all recent benefits from advances in modern science and medicine. In short, it inflicts unnecessary and preventable suffering on the vulnerable. Emerging COVID-19 vaccines and treatments likewise appear to be no exception to this crisis of human rights. Despite ongoing international initiatives, it appears that life-saving COVID-19 vaccines remain at risk of being treated as marketplace commodities available only to those countries and people who can afford to pay the asking price. Our access to medicines is intrinsically linked with principle of equality and non-discrimination, transparency, participation, and accountability. Raising awareness on medical accessibility rights is a timely and important issue for all involved stakeholders in order to ensure that no patient is left behind, whether diagnosed with COVID-19 or any other diseases. I believe that this forum will be an excellent opportunity and beginning to explore how COVID-19 vaccines and other medicines can be promoted as public goods for humanity, not only for those in Asia, but across the whole globe. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to today's discussions.
감사합니다, 서창록 교수님. 다음으로는 대한민국 보건복지부 장관이신 권덕철님의 환영사를 듣도록 하겠습니다.
안녕하십니까. 보건복지부 장관 권덕철입니다. 휴먼 아시아 A2M 포럼 개요를 진심으로 축하드립니다. 아시아 국가의 의약품 접근성 개선 방안을 논의하기 위해 세계보건기구, 제약업계, 학계 등의 전문가가 모인 귀한 자리에 인사를 드리게 되어 영광입니다. 오늘 행사를 마련해 주신 휴먼 아시아 서창록 대표님, 한국인권학회 이주영 회장님을 비롯한 모든 관계자분들의 노고에 깊이 감사드립니다. 아시아의 여러 국가가 질병 치료에 필수적인 의약품에 대한 접근성을 향상시키기 위해 고군분투하고 있습니다. 특히 지난해 코로나19가 발생한 이후에는 코로나19 백신, 치료제를 확보하는 데 어려움을 겪은 국가가 많을 것으로 생각합니다. 이러한 시기에 오늘 포럼은 포스트 코로나19 시대 아시아의 백신 등 의약품 접근성 개선을 주제로 진행됩니다. 미국, 유럽 등에 비해 상대적으로 의약품 접근성이 낮은 아시아 국가들이 코로나19 백신, 치료제뿐만 아니라 그 외 치료에 필수적인 의약품의 접근성에 관한 최신 동향과 정보를 교류하고 미래로의 발전 방향을 논의하는 뜻깊은 자리라고 생각합니다. 현재 대한민국은 코로나19 위기 속에서 국민, 기업, 정부 등 사회 구성원이 연대와 협력으로 코로나19 종식을 위해 노력하고 있습니다. 방역수칙 준수와 거리두기, 의료 역량 확충 등을 통해 감염 확산을 억제하고 있으나 백신과 치료제를 도입하고 개발하여 예방, 치료에 투입하는 것이야말로 가장 근본적이고도 확실한 방안일 것입니다. 대한민국은 지난해부터 코로나19 백신 도입과 접종을 준비하여 지난 2월 26일부터 요양병원 입소자와 종사자를 시작으로 예방접종을 시행하고 있습니다. 또한 대한민국 정부는 백신과 치료제의 개발을 위해 범정부 지원위원회를 구성하고 끝까지 지원한다는 원칙하에 전임상 단계에서 임상시험, 생산까지 전주기 지원 정책을 적극 추진하고 있습니다. 아울러 대한민국 정부는 코로나 외에도 시장 기능만으로는 안정적인 공급이 어려운 503개의 의약품을 국가 필수 의약품으로 지정하여 국민의 의약품 접근성 향상을 위해 노력하고 있습니다. 대한민국의 이러한 노력과 경험이 대한민국을 넘어 다른 아시아 국가들에서도 코로나 백신 치료제 개발과 보급, 그리고 필수 의약품에 대한 접근성 향상의 귀중한 자산이 될 수 있기를 희망합니다. 이번 포럼을 통해 질병의 예방과 치료를 필요로 하는 사람들이 투명하고 공정하게 의약품에 접근할 수 있도록 생산적인 논의가 이루어지기를 기대합니다. 또한 의료 인프라 강화, 비전염성 질병 및 기타 치료제에 대한 접근 등 다양한 이슈에 대한 심도 있는 논의를 통해 앞으로 우리가 나아가야 할 방향을 모색할 수 있기를 기대합니다. 다시 한번 A2M 포럼 개최를 축하드리며 참석해 주신 모든 분들의 건강과 발전을 기원합니다. 감사합니다.
네, 감사합니다. 다음은 오픈 소사이어티 파운데이션즈의 공중보건 프로그램 상임 고문으로 재직 중이신 록사나 보네님의 환영사를 듣도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you, and thanks to Human Asia for organizing today's meeting. My name is Roxana Banel, and I am a senior advisor at the Open Society Foundation's health program. You know, COVID has really brought both the very best about humanity and the very worst about humanity out. So, you know, on one hand, we see building on 2 decades of science and research, scientists being able to create diagnostics and vaccines in very, very short periods of time with incredibly high effectiveness. But at the same time, we see a world where equitable access realistically doesn't exist today. Vaccines, diagnostics, and essential PPEs are not being treated by any country as common goods. So I think this is a really timely gathering to really contemplate what South Korea can do and can take, what kind of actions the country can take to help what is right now a pretty dark global picture, especially for the most marginalized, the world's poorest people. Their situations are pretty distressing right now. So I hope this meeting can come up with some concrete steps that South Korea can lead on. So now a little bit about me and the organization that I work for and why I'm speaking to you today. The Open Society Foundation is a private foundation founded about 4 decades ago by George Soros. We are the world's largest private funder of groups working for justice, democratic governance, and human rights all around the world. I am in the Health and Rights Program based out of New York City, and we have been funding access to affordable medicines globally for the last 15 years. We started funding access to medicines work in South Korea a couple of years ago, and the meeting today is being supported out of one of the grants we gave to start student organizing around access to medicines in South Korea. OSF also has an office in Seoul. It is an office that does programming across East Asia and is focused on human rights work, particularly the rights of women, LGBTQ populations, and migrants. So access to medicines is not a new problem for the world. This isn't something COVID created. COVID is just amplifying and deepening access to medicines issues that we have had as a global community, including in Asia, for a very long time. So what does that picture look like today? And why did I say it's a pretty dark one for a lot of populations around the world? Despite massive public inflows of taxpayer money, and when I say massive, I mean more than 100 billion US dollars in the last year to do R&D on vaccines and diagnostics and manufacture them. Corporate manufacturers have continued to generally charge what the market can bear. So what does that mean practically? It means that vaccines, diagnostics, and many essential PPEs are not available in most countries around the world. As of a couple of weeks ago, when I last looked at the data, 75% of all vaccinations, all COVID vaccinations that have taken place in the entire world have taken place in 10 countries. Over 100 countries have yet to receive a single dose of a COVID vaccine. So given this picture, it's kind of hard to be optimistic about global solidarity and effective cooperation between countries. So I really hope that today, based on a pretty good track record from South Korea has done a lot better than many other countries in responding to the COVID epidemic, as you all know better than I do. So I hope today we can all build on that to figure out steps that South Korea can take to lead us in a direction that gets us to more equitable and affordable access to vaccines and diagnostics and essential PPEs, both today and for the future. So again, just thanks to Human Asia for organizing us all together. And I look forward to joining the conversations and hearing the discussion. Thank you for having me.
록사나 보넬 고문님 감사합니다. 이제 기조연설에 국경 없는 의사의 한국의 티에리 코펜스 사무총장님을 무대 위로 초대합니다.
Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here and not through a screen and to see people after so many months of COVID-19 measures, even if they are very efficient, I would say, here in Korea. I would like really to thank Human Asia and also the Open Society Foundation for inviting me for this, what I would call, timely forum for the keynote speech. Briefly about Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, is a medical humanitarian organization founded 50 years ago, and to provide medical assistance to people in need and to testify also on crises we see in our field of operation. MSF responds today to conflict and violence, epidemics, natural disaster, and lack of access to healthcare. Today we have over 45,000 working force in over 70 countries where we treat patients under sometimes some of the most challenging and difficult circumstances. For our humanitarian work, MSF received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1999, in addition to other prizes such as the Seoul Peace Prize in 1996, so a few years ago. In his acceptance speech of the Nobel Peace Prize, Dr. James Orbinski, who was at the time the MSF International president, said that our next challenge is the market failure of building research and development for disease of priority for the global population. And he called for governments, international institutions, pharmaceutical industries, and civil society also to confront the injustice of inequitable access to medicines. With the funds we received at the time of the Nobel Peace Prize, MSF launched the Access campaign, aiming to make treatment, vaccines, and diagnostic tools available, affordable, and suitable for the population we serve around the world. The first issue of this Access campaign was, some of you recall, the high price of the HIV/AIDS drugs or patient who had to pay for the cost of the treatment for 1 year above $10,000. This was in 2001. This was a time when a few companies had a monopoly over the HIV drug market. This luxurious price tag was, as you can imagine, far beyond reach for most of our patients and the global population. After years of aggressively tackling this issue, competition started to occur in the market, and the price today is less than $100 per year for a patient. As much as this appears to be a success story, the HIV challenge was only a small fraction of a global problem. And the same type of challenge caused by this market failure continues to appear in different shapes and aspects across various diseases, areas, and regions. disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable. And today, as we struggle with the COVID-19 pandemic, the market failure is more evident than ever. The global impact of the COVID-19 is tremendous. The number of patients surpass 100 million, and the number of deaths exceed 2 million. But COVID-19 not only directly takes people's lives, with the collapse of healthcare system and essential services not being provided anymore, the number of people whose health has been affected or who may have lost their life as a result will far exceed the COVID-19 cases. While this pandemic has brought suffering, fear, and death to population everywhere, the impact is not shared equally. Those who suffer the greatest are those who have already been suffering. As the world abandons solidarity and turns to nationalistic rhetoric, those who have been already neglected are further forgotten. And even within our own society, we see disparities in healthcare access between those who have the means and those who are excluded from the system. As countries close their borders, those who have been forced to flee their homes face closed doors. I think about refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced people are frequently disregarded, and little consideration is given to migrants. Those reliant on aid and those with neglected disease suffer disproportionately from this pandemic. In many low-resource settings where healthcare provision is already inadequate, the number of functional health centers continues to shrink. The restriction imposed by states as part of the COVID-19 measures, including movement restrictions, often limit the care MSF can provide. While some high-income countries have started vaccinating low-risk segments of their population against the COVID-19, frontline doctors in many countries where we work do not have an idea of when they may be able to be vaccinated. In the meantime, the world's poorest countries have postponed their regular vaccination program in response to limitations imposed by the COVID-19. That means that over 100 million people, mostly children, may not be vaccinated during the pandemic or miss their scheduled vaccines, thus exposing them to life-threatening disease. This will lead to an increase of infectious disease and death even after the pandemic is over. The inequalities are once again evident in the allocation of COVID-19 medical tools, such as diagnostic treatments and vaccines. While wealthy countries are vaccinating their population, some countries are still struggling to properly test and diagnosing their own population. No, there are global access initiatives such as the ACT, the Access to the COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, and the COVAX facility, but the very government that should be supporting this solidarity initiative have been moving in the direction of nationalism by hoarding medical supplies through bilateral agreements and limiting or threatening to limit export to other countries in need. Companies are running business as usual, registering exclusive intellectual property over their public-funded innovation and signing undisclosed agreements with no transparency over price and supply. During an unprecedented pandemic that is taking so many lives, treatments and vaccines should not be seen as an opportunity for political control or profit. Over $10 billion have been poured into the development of the COVID-19 vaccines, and that is only for the few front-running Western vaccines and vaccines candidates. People from all over the world have participated in clinical trials in support of the development of these vaccines. Yet, these vaccines are ordered by a few countries, securing far more vaccines than what they really need. Wealthy countries that represent 14% of the world's population have bought up more than half of the vaccines, and just 10 countries have administered 75% of all vaccination so far. Contrast that with 100 countries who have not received a single dose of vaccines. Today, what the world has lost beside the lives of many loved ones is the humanity that binds us together. The treatment we most urgently need is the solidarity to overcome this pandemic together. We ask governments that have secured more doses than needed to share with the global initiative, or contributing in any other form of solidarity and support with other countries, to help those countries to vaccinate their high-risk priority groups. We also ask pharmaceutical companies that produce the COVID-19 vaccines or treatments to set aside sufficient manufacturing capacity, which is really a key point, or doses for low and middle-income countries. We ask all companies to sell COVID-19 treatments and vaccines at universally acceptable at cost price. And we ask governments to include concrete commitments for access and price in funding provisions to companies. Access and affordability must be a solid commitment to overcome this pandemic. Infectious disease has no borders. During these unprecedented times, overcoming the pandemic requires global action and solidarity. In addition to protecting their own population, governments need to unite together for a global response rather than pursuing an inward national strategy. Today, MSF teams are directly responding to the COVID-19 pandemic in over 45 countries worldwide. We are supporting authorities to provide care for COVID-19 patients, protecting people who are vulnerable and at risk, and keeping essential medical service running. For the past 50 years, we see that behind each statistic, there is a human face and human suffering. We should not forget this. This should always be at the heart of the decision we take. There is no financial profit more important than human lives, and there should be no borders in saving life. Once again, I would really like to thank the humanitarian team, the UAEM, and the Korean Association of Human Rights Studies for organizing this forum, and I hope today's discussion will be another stepping stone to enhance people's access to medical tools. Thank you very much.
네, 티에리 코펜스 사무총장님께 감사 말씀 전해드립니다.
첫 번째 세션을 시작하기에 앞서 오늘 저희 A2M 포럼과 함께 해주실 연사님들을 무대로 초대해 기념 차례를 진행하도록 하겠습니다.
이후에 휴식 시간을 가지고 첫 번째 세션 공평한 범세계적 의약품 접근을 향하여 아시아의 코비드-19 백신 및 의약품을 중심으로를 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 발표자분들께서는 모두 무대 위로 나와주시길 바랍니다.
이제 첫 번째 세션 공평한 범세계적 의약품 접근을 향하여 아시아의 COVID-19 백신 및 의약품을 중심으로를 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 이번 세션의 사회자는 한림대학교 의과대학 부교수님이시자 한림대학교 강남 성심병원 감염내과 교수님이신 이재갑 교수님이십니다. 사회자를 연단으로 모시도록 하겠습니다.
예, 방금 소개받은 이제 한림의대 이재갑입니다. 이런 특히 이제 그 코로나 상황이 이제 백신 접종의 시대가 됐는데 이제 가장 중요한 백신 자체의 공급망에 관한 그런 공평의 문제에 대해서 이런 휴먼아시아와 또한 이제 UAEM 또 한국인권학회에서 이런 주제를 다뤄주신 것에 상당히 감사하게 생각드리고요. 사실 국내에서도 이제 접종의 권리에 대한 논의들이 많지만 전 세계적으로 특히 이제 그 저소득 국가들에 대한 백신이 어떻게 공급될 건가에 대해서 많은 난관들이 존재하는 상황인 것 같습니다. 오늘은 세 분의 발표가 있는데요. 첫 번째 발표부터 이제 소개드리고 시작하겠습니다. 첫 번째 발표는 마리안젤라 시마오 세계보건기구 의약품 건강품 접근성 부국장님께서 아시아 지역 코로나19 백신 인권 기반 접근이라는 내용으로 강의해 주시겠습니다. 강의 중간중간에 질문 있으신 분들은 이제 카카오톡이라든지 이메일로 보내주시면 좀 이따가 강의가 새 연자의 발표가 마치고 나서 일단 함께 Q&A 세션을 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 예, 마리안젤레 시마오 강의 시작 부탁드립니다.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, and let me say it's a pleasure to be with you today, although it's 3 o'clock in the morning in Geneva, but it's a very important forum, and I'm very glad to be here. Let me say that I'll speak a little bit about the human rights approach COVID vaccines 19 from the global perspective. As I'm working at the moment, I'm coordinating in WHO side the allocation, the fair and equitable allocation for COVID vaccines together with colleagues from Gavi. And let me say this past year has been incredibly challenging for all of us. I'm at the end of my career, and I joke many times that the only time I remember working so hard when I was in the last year of medical school. But at the time I was 22 years old and felt less tired than I am right now. It has been a challenging year for all of us because it has affected our individual lives, it has affected our professional activities, our financial situation, and this is all derived from the global impact that this pandemic is having on the world. But in spite of all these complexities, we have seen some positive developments. In WHO, together with other partners, you will have heard of this, has launched the ACT-A accelerator, the Access to COVID Tools accelerator earlier last year. And the ACT-A has 4 pillars. The vaccine that we're going to talk about today, therapeutics, diagnostics, and health systems accelerator. And the overall aim was to accelerate research and development and to ensure the world was ready to receive the safe and effective technologies that we hoped would come. And why we had, you're all specialists, you know that vaccines normally take 5-10 years to be developed. We have seen unprecedented level investment in vaccines R&D from governments and from companies. We have seen an unprecedented collaboration between researchers as well. In less than 10 months from the beginning of this pandemic, we actually had at least 10 vaccine candidates at late stage, late trial, phase 3 trials. So this was really, really moving fast. And COVAX is the vaccine pillar of the ACT-A, which is convened by CEPI, Gavi, and by WHO. COVAX had, by the middle of last year, contracted volumes to equitably deliver 2 billion doses of COVID vaccines by the end of 2021 through what we call the COVAX facility. The COVAX facility is a mechanism, international mechanism, that was joined by 190 countries, and that aims to ensure that all participants, countries, territories, and regions receive COVID vaccine without having to go to bilateral deals, all of them. We have now 3 vaccines that were emergency use listed by WHO, and one of them, I'm pleased to say, it's from the Republic of Korea. It's the AstraZeneca vaccine that's produced in Korea. WHO is at the moment assessing at the late stage of assessment of 4 other vaccines. We have the 2 Korean vaccines plus Pfizer. We are at the final stages for authorization of Moderna and the final stages for assessment of Sinopharm, Sinovac, and now J&J during the month of March. This vaccine should be assessed by the end of March. And we all know the need that the vaccines won't, it's not the panacea, it's not going to help everyone everywhere. We don't have enough coverage, we don't have enough supply. So together with the preventive measures, and I see people in this event in Korea wearing masks with hand hygiene and with all the other measures, avoid social distancing, avoiding crowds, and to a certain extent lockdowns. We think we do have a good chance now that the vaccines have come to end the acute phase of this pandemic. But we only have that chance if we don't approach the issues of availability of vaccines through a human rights lens. And what do I say that? The equity perspective, right? That all those in need, and who are those in need at this moment? The SAGE, the Strategic Advisory Group that does the WHO recommendations on vaccine immunization, those who are most in need at this moment are the healthcare workers, frontline workers, and people with older people and people with severe disease. So when we're talking about equity, the reality is that in spite of the growing number of vaccine options, current manufacturing capacity meets only a fraction of what's needed. So we have a case where we have a small supply versus a large demand. And we have market forces at play at this critical junction that don't make the environment very conducive for an equity approach. And let me say why, because as of yesterday, we had 271 million doses administered in the world, vaccines, right? And out of this, 79%, 80% were in just 10 countries, right? And 115 economies had started vaccinating, but 65 were high-income countries. So you see, we have 270 million, 80% of the doses were administered in 10 countries. And last week, we started to deliver the first doses, the AstraZeneca doses from SII and from Korea, started to be delivered. We have 15 countries that have already received vaccines, 10 more countries that are receiving this week, which account to more or less 20 million doses being distributed through the COVAX facility. Why is this happening? You know, why such a difference? Because these numbers reflect the large volumes of doses that were secured and supplied by bilateral agreements. And they also, in a way, you know, when countries went, instead of going for a global solution that would ensure that all countries had access, timely access to the vaccines, many high-income countries went into bilateral agreements, which reflect a lack of commitment to ensure a steady supply to allow that all priority populations are vaccinated first in every country, and not aiming to vaccinate all citizens in one country. And we are saying health workers and people at higher risk of dying, people over 65 and people with comorbidities. The COVAX facility first allocation of AstraZeneca doses has a goal to reach the 142 countries that were eligible for this by the end of March with 85 million doses. And this is done through an allocation mechanism, which is housed in WHO, but managed together with Gavi, which runs an algorithm and ensures that the available number of vaccines in COVAX are equitably distributed among the different COVAX participants. And let me say that the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, a while ago, he called vaccine equity the biggest moral test for the global community. I think we are failing that test, right? Dr. Tedros, a few weeks ago, he called this, that we are facing a moral catastrophic failure. And he's right, because fair and equitable vaccine distribution is essential not only to build trust and to maintain international peace and prevent violence, but the Secretary also mentioned, Secretary General, we also make sure that all countries can access vaccines and to make sure that those vaccines reach the arms of people who most need them. So we say, WHO says the best way to end this pandemic, stop future variants, and save lives is to limit the spread of the virus is by vaccinating quickly and equitably the vaccines that are available, ensuring the right to health remains at the core of the vaccine rollout. And at present, I already mentioned I'm bringing other statistics. We have rich countries with just 16% of the world population have bought more than 16%, okay? 16% of the population, 1/6, have bought more than 60% of the world's vaccine supply. So in a nutshell, vaccine nationalism is not only morally unacceptable because it makes us all losers, right? From the epidemiological perspective, from the economic perspective, and from the moral perspective. Because unlike SARS, this COVID spreads early, sometimes silently, before symptoms develop. And even if they do, and it's indifferent to borders and barriers. I was reading last night an article from an op-ed from a US where the scientist there was asked what vaccine would he take. He said, I will take the vaccine that's available tomorrow because this virus is bad. So when we're talking about the need to increase global solidarity and increase vaccine equity, we are talking about all countries realizing, and here I'm talking about all countries and the populations as well, because there are pressure to vaccinate everyone. Realizing that equitable access to vaccine is also at the center of countries' self-interest. And I say that why? Because allowing the majority of the world's population to go unvaccinated provides more opportunity for the virus to evolve and the potential to develop mutations that may prove to be vaccine resistant increase, right? So let me just say, from a human rights perspective, I'm going to quote Dr. Tedros in a recent op-ed when he said that the effect of vaccine inequity is that unprotected populations will continue to suffer the enormous secondary effects of this pandemic, right? The lockdowns mean economic devastation with more people thrown into poverty, more children left uneducated, more child brides, more teenage pregnancies and child labors, even more lives cut off their potential. And let's face it, the effect of losing schooling is permanent and has life impact. Growing vaccine nationalism is economically counterproductive for rich countries. And we have a study that was done by the International Chamber of Commerce that showed that the full vaccination of the population only in rich countries, while neglected the other countries, could cost rich countries as much as $4.5 trillion in lost economic activity. And then we have other initiatives that are ongoing, trying to bring, for example, more manufacturing capacity. WHO last year, at the request from the president of Costa Rica and 40 other countries, has launched the COVID Technology Access Pool, we call it CITA. That means to foster open sharing of technology, licensing of IP and know-how. This could also help to address some of the production bottlenecks. WHO also has issued a call to all countries to work together in solidarity and, like I said, in their best interest to ensure that within the first 100 days of this year, 2021, vaccination of health workers and older people was underway in all countries. This is a call for action, which is at the heart of WHO's campaign for vaccine equity. And we have a vaccine equity declaration, which was launched in 19th of February, calling on countries and companies to ensure that by the time we reach the World Health Day, which is 7th of April, COVID vaccines are being administered in every country. And this is a symbol of hope for us to overcome both the pandemic and the inequalities that lie at the root of so many of the global health challenges. So to ensure that vaccine rollout begins on all countries in this 100 years, it's imperative that governments that have vaccinated their own health workers and populations at higher risk of severe disease share the vaccines through COVAX so that other countries can do so. And governments that have already stocked a lot of vaccines through different contracts, they should stop doing new contracts and avoid trying to dip into the vaccines like the Serum Institute of India vaccine, which is being called by many of these countries that already have large quantities of doses bought by them, has also that we're calling that countries do not try to dip into the share, which is the global supply right now, because there's not enough for everyone. And we need to guarantee that low and middle income countries and many upper middle income countries, like the Republic of Korea, can also have access to. There are several other issues I'm gonna start to finalize because vaccine manufacturers allocate them. We also call on vaccine manufacturers to allocate the limited doses supply equitably, and that they also share efficacy in manufacturing data as a priority with WHO for regulatory and policy review. That they step up and maximize production, and that they can use voluntary licensing and transfer of technology to other manufacturers, and WHO is strongly recommended they do it through the Medicines Patent Pool, which is a tried platform, transparent and an open platform. Well, again, the pandemic will not be over until it's over everywhere. And this is the reality of the world we live in because it's a very interconnected world. And I'm going to finalize my words today with a recent quote also from Dr. Tedros when he said, that to the virus, we are one herd, and to beat the virus, we must act as one community. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
부국장님께서 전 세계 백신 공급의 상황과 또 백신 보급의 형평성에 관한 부분을 인권적인 측면에서 발표해 주셨거든요. 어쩌면 이제 한국도 이제 고민해야 되는 이제 문제가 되고 있는 것 같습니다. 한국의 이제 그 SK바이오사이언스에서 노바백스 백신과 아스트라제네카 백신을 공급하는 역할도 만들고 있고요. 사실 또 SK바이오사이언스 같은 경우에는 이제 세피와 빌 게이츠 재널한테 펀딩을 받아가지고 실제로 이제 올해 말 또는 내년 초에 이제 한국에서 만든 백신을 이제 만들고 주된 공급을 WHO 공급하기로 지금 예정이 돼 있는 측면들이 있거든요. 그래서 이런 부분에 있어서 한국의 역할들도 중요한데 오늘 이 부국장님의 그 해안을 통해서 한국도 이런 부분에 잘 동참할 수 있고 이런 부분에 대한 준비들을 해 나가야 되는 게 아닌가 생각이 듭니다. 예, 두 번째 발제는 록사나 보넬 오픈 소사이어티 재단 공중 보건 프로그램 상임 고문께서 발표해 주실 건데요. 주제는 증가하는 불평등의 해소, 코로나19 시대 속 민간 분야의 역할. 정말 한국에 꼭 들어야 되는 그런 주제 같습니다. 이 주제 부탁드리겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Professor Lee. And I have to say, I am so impressed by Dr. Samal that she woke up at 3 a.m. to give a presentation and she made sense. Surely if I were speaking with all of you at 3 o'clock in the morning, I would not make sense. So a lot of appreciation to her for joining us. I am going to share a story with you all today. It is a story of growing inequality, of growing health disparities, and unequal access to medicines. And as I said in my welcoming remarks, none of this is new. COVID did not create these challenges. These challenges have been around for a really long time. What COVID has done has shown a very stark light on problems that we have not been able to address as humanity for the last decades. So what is it that we see about inequality over the last year? Globally, wage inequality has increased by 30%. And this is because a lot of people have lost their jobs and a lot of people's wages have decreased. And as always, with any kind of inequality, the populations who suffer the most are the world's most marginalized and the world's poorest. At the same time that we see wages going down pretty much everywhere, we see advanced large companies becoming even larger, increasing market shares, leading to a situation that is basically less competitive markets. So wages are going down, prices are going up. We all know what that's going to look like, right? At the end of the pandemic, things are going to be probably economically even worse than they are today. So COVID is a really unique and I hope transformative moment when we can all start thinking and acting differently. And what I mean by that is structures and systems need to change so that they are working for the many and not only the wealthy few. So my slides will not move. Can you help me there? There. So what is it that we see in the response to COVID? As I said earlier, there has been about 113 billion US dollars spent so far on COVID diagnostic, vaccine, therapeutic technology, R&D, and manufacturing. That number does not include China and Russia because those numbers haven't been released by China and Russia. So 71% of that 113 billion is from governments, which means it is from you and it's from me. It is from taxpayers. So if you take 71% of 113 billion, you get over $80 billion globally from people like you and me have contributed to vaccine and diagnostic R&D and manufacturing. Of that 113 billion US dollars, 13% has been contributed by South Korean taxpayers. This means that 16 trillion won of South Korean taxpayer public money has gone into vaccines and diagnostics. That's a good thing. It's a pandemic and it is a government role everywhere to step in and to fund needed R&D and manufacturing so that we can all have a healthy future. So I am really happy that my government, that your government that all of us have contributed to this through our tax-paying dollars and won. The next slide I'm going to show you is a picture of the results of this 16 trillion won from you all and $113 billion from the global community. And when you see my next slide, what I would like each of you to ask yourself is 3 questions. Is this a fair picture? Is this a just picture? Is this a rights-respecting picture? Here's the slide. So what has been the response from $80 billion of public money, 16 trillion won of South Korean taxpayer money? Pfizer is selling its 2-dose vaccine for 80% profit margin globally. AstraZeneca only committed to selling at lower price for their vaccine through July 2021. So what, in 4 months? The Serum Institute in India. Of course, India is known as being the pharmacy of the world, selling quality, low-priced medicines throughout the world. The Serum Institute in India is selling vaccines at higher prices than AstraZeneca to some countries. Lower and middle income countries in the global south are paying more than high income countries for some vaccines. The example there is Uganda paying almost $11 for a vaccine that is available for $3 in Europe. How is that possible? Diagnostics, we also see huge markups for some products in some countries. Pfizer and Moderna, the 2 companies making the mRNA vaccines, are set to make $32 billion in 2021 profit. Those vaccines saw $2.5 billion in investment. Moderna's vaccine was totally funded, the R&D and manufacturing, by public funds. And the profit estimated is $32 billion. So again, I ask, is this a fair picture? Is this a just picture? Is this a rights-respecting picture? I'll let you all answer it for yourself. So then we go to the South Korean picture. And I have to say, it was fairly difficult for me to find data in English that I could use in this slide. And all of you in the room and on the line, I'm sure know all of this much better than I do. So what do I see on this slide that is really good and that South Korea should be really proud about? First of all, you have been a leader in diagnostic R&D and diagnostic manufacturing for the world. Secondly, you as a country are taking on vaccine R&D and manufacturing, which potentially is an important contribution. And thirdly, and maybe the most important in some ways, medicine prices in Korea for the domestic market have been controlled by your national health insurance system better than just about any other place in the world. How I wish my own country of the United States had a price control system like you have in South Korea. How I wish the world had such a system. So I think South Korea should be proud of all of that. What is it that I see that I question in this slide? Well, again, I wonder, while it's fantastic to have diagnostic companies that can do the R&D and that can do the manufacturing and export needed life-saving diagnostics to the world, I wonder what a fair profit during a pandemic on life-saving devices is. I also wonder on vaccines. From what I understand, Novavax and SK Bioscience, there will, of course, be vaccine manufacturing, but there are exclusivity concerns. And what I mean by that is, are those vaccines only going to be available to South Korean domestic market? Are they only going to be available to a few countries outside of South Korea? Wouldn't it be fantastic if instead South Korea could sell and make available globally quality, low price vaccines to communities, the most marginalized and the poorest around the world? Wouldn't that be an amazing leadership step for South Korea to make? And finally, wouldn't it be really an important global contribution to think about what lessons South Korea has learned from being able to successfully control drug prices domestically, and think about how to better do that for exports, especially to countries that cannot afford expensive medicines, expensive vaccines, expensive diagnostics. So that's what I think about when I look at this slide. So an overall landscape, what do we see? We see high prices for vaccines, fairly high prices for some diagnostics, and also essential PPE. Though the R&D is almost all publicly funded, and there are advanced commitments for purchase that de-risk the companies who are making the vaccines and the other technologies. Governments, as far as I know, nowhere are including access or tech transfer conditions on public funding. And practically what I mean by that is a government in a contract that is our money, that's taxpayer money, going to a lab or a company for R&D or manufacture, could include pricing caps or could include expectations of technology transfer to other sites outside of South Korea who need to be able to build that manufacturing capacity. That's not happening anywhere. There's also no transparency of R&D and production costs. We don't know, even though we, taxpayers, are putting in almost all the money, we have no idea the costs that the companies and labs are expending for the R&D and the manufacturing. None of that's publicly available. Therefore, price is not tied to cost. Price is generally calculated by what the market will bear, rather than tied to cost, R&D and production costs, with a fair profit. And finally, there is almost no pharmaceutical manufacturing outside of the global north and east. Less than 1% of vaccines used in Africa, and these are not COVID vaccines, these are all vaccines, childhood vaccines, adult vaccines, all vaccines. Less than 1% are made on the continent of Africa. 95% of all PPEs are being imported to Africa. Again, the question is justice and rights within this landscape. So clearly, we need a different pathway for companies. And I just want to pause here and say, I really think companies are important. I think they are a really important actor in making sure we have the R&D and the pharmaceutical products and technologies that we need as a global community. But I also think they need to act in a fair and just way. So what do I think that they need to be paying attention to? And what should governments be paying attention to and helping guide the companies in certain behavior? So first of all, R&D needs to be needs-based. The global community does not need frivolous R&D. R&D needs to be adapted to needs beyond the global north, beyond high-end companies, high-income countries, right? Companies need to be committed to both low-cost manufacturing and low price. Companies definitely need to sustain themselves. They need to survive. We need them. And in a fair world, they need to also benefit from profit. It's just the profit needs to be fair profit. And we really need to think about companies sharing with the global south through tech transfer. And this is really important both for the pandemic, but also for a more just, healthy, and secure world in the future. So now I'm going to share with you a couple of company stories that I think are so inspiring. And this slide on my projector or on my printout has photos on it, and I'm sorry if you all can't see that. Biologic is a UK-based biotech company. It is a company that developed at-home pregnancy tests in the 1980s. So they do extremely high quality diagnostics for many diseases. And they've existed for decades. So Biologic and its founders are committed to three things. They're committed to transparency, sharing, and fair profit. So what does that practically mean? It means that they developed a COVID antigen rapid home test that costs $1, and 75% of their production goes to the global south. They promise it will go to the global south and at a price that is affordable for public systems in the global south. They also openly publish their R&D and manufacturing costs. What did they actually put into making that diagnostic test? And they publish the price. So anyone can look at what did this cost, what is the price, and can compare and see, is that a fair profit? Finally, they are also committed to sharing with the rest of the world. And they have, and that's what you're missing here maybe, it's a photo of a diagnostic manufacturing facility in Dakar, Senegal. And Biologic has built this facility with the Institut Pasteur Dakar in Senegal. It is now up and running. The tech transfer was all done at cost by Biologic. The facility is already producing 3 to 4 million COVID diagnostics this year, with the anticipation to go up to 40 million diagnostic tests within the next couple of years, with the long-term goal going up to 200 million diagnostic tests on the African continent. This is the first scaled manufacturing site for diagnostics on the African continent. Wouldn't it be fantastic if a South Korean diagnostic company did something like this some other place? Wouldn't that show South Korean leadership in a way that the whole world could look at and I would hope emulate, just like I am kind of highlighting to you all the Biologic case today. Another example of, I think, a really interesting and admirable company. This company is called Universals, and it is based in Belgium. And basically, so the photo here is a biologic manufacturing pod. It is about the size of a train car. It is deployable anywhere on the earth. It is portable, so it can be moved easily, and it's flexible. And what I mean by flexible is that as long as you can connect this to water and electricity, it can make biologics, and it can also make viral vector vaccines. So biologics are insulin or many of the cancer medicines, right? One of these pods is already in Ecuador and is producing cancer medicine there. They're going to be using these potentially to ship out so that some decentralized manufacturing of vaccines can also happen in a few sites. So they are relatively inexpensive. They can be deployed and up and running in 12 months' time. And again, this is a company that said, we need to change the world. And we need to change the world, not just by making something and selling it. We need to share our technology. We need to share our know-how so that in the next epidemic, the next pandemic, the next health crisis, we all have a healthier and safer world. So finally, what do I think South Korea can do to create a more equal world, to create a healthier world, to create a juster world? First of all, ensure affordability of products. Continue to assure it domestically and really expand some of that thinking to exports and what the affordability options are globally. Connect access, and by access, I mean pricing. So connect pricing and tech transfer conditions to public funding, to that 16 trillion won that you all gave this year to COVID R&D and manufacturing. Debate nationally what fair profit means. I told you, I believe in fair profit, but let's have a conversation about what that means. Align industrial policy with global solidarity pledges and commit to decentralized manufacturing. Again, that's going to make the world safer for South Koreans. It's going to make the world more just for all of us. So I hope at least some of these things you can take forward in discussions and potentially leadership decisions in South Korea moving forward. Thanks for having me today, and thanks for all of your attention.
예, 록스나보네 상임고문님께서 이제 전 세계 기업들에 대한 그런 백신 가격이라든지 진단 키트의 가격의 문제점들, 또는 앞으로 이제 특히 이제 감명 있게 들은 거는 한국이 어떻게 나가야 될지에 대한 부분들을 아주 구체적으로 이제 말씀을 해주셔서 정말 감사드리고요. 이런 내용들이 언론에 많이 공개돼서 실제 이런 업무를 맡고 있는 이제 담당자들 또한 이제 기업들에게 좀 많은 울림이 되기를 소망합니다. 이제 마지막으로 이제 지금 한 가지 이제 코멘트 해달라고 이제 부탁이 왔는데요. 지금 하단 그 화면 하단에 보게 되면 문의를 할 수 있는 이메일이 있습니다. 2021 forum@humanasiaorg 여기에 질문을 보내주시면 Q&A 세션에 그 플로우 또는 그 온라인으로 참여하시는 분들의 질문에 대해서 연자들이 대답을 해주실 거니까요. 이메일을 통해서 질문 보내주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 마지막 발제는 하신의 국경 없는 의사의 한국 대외협력 보좌관께서 의료도구의 공정한 배분, 코로나19 시대를 넘어서란 주제로 발표해 주시겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Hello, everyone. I will be presenting also in English to be consistent with the other colleagues who presented in this session. First of all, I would like to thank the Human Asia team for giving me the opportunity to present. I realized that among the colleagues that are sharing the session, I am the only one who is in an ideal time zone to be giving a presentation. I hope mine makes as much sense as theirs because they just gave a very good snapshot of what are the needs and what are the challenges that the global health community is facing today. Okay, just to give a very brief introduction about the organization I work for. So MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, also known as Doctors Without Borders, was founded in 1971. And during the past 50 years, we have been working on humanitarian medical fields in areas of conflict, natural disaster, but also in epidemics, and where there are challenges on access to basic health care. And recognized for our efforts around the humanitarian needs, we received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1999. And with the funds that we received for the Nobel Peace Prize, we launched what we call it the Access Campaign, which is an organization within the MSF that works to address the issue of access to essential medicines for our patients and for the population that we serve. In 1999, when we received the Nobel Peace Prize, in the acceptance speech, we addressed the social injustice of market failure in the R&D. We talked about how the market is failing to develop and to deliver the right medical tools for the people in need. And 22 years from then, we now realize that this injustice that we saw in 1999 has actually not been solved at all. In fact, the gap has only grown wider and have become more evident now with the COVID-19 pandemic. What is the market failure that we're seeing? Sometimes we joke that we are not doctors without borders, but that we are doctors without medicines. So what we are facing right now, not even before COVID-19, what we are constantly facing in our humanitarian action is that medicines, vaccines, and diagnostic tools are unavailable, or unaffordable, or unsuitable, or maybe all of them. Unavailable, a typical case was back during the Ebola crisis when MSF was responding to the majority of Ebola patients in West Africa. And back then, there were no Ebola treatments, nor vaccines that we could use to treat and to stop the disease. Unaffordable, that was the situation for the HIV drugs that we had to deal with in the early 2000s. But also recently, when there was a new hepatitis C drug that was developed, the sofosbuvir, the price was $1,000 per pill, and that culminates to over $147,000 for a 12-week regimen. And that cost is something that even the wealthy people in the high-income country could not afford. So that, of course, you can imagine, was an inaccessible price for most of the people that we serve. So the unaffordability of the drugs is something we are constantly facing. The unsuitability of the medical tools is also one issue we continue to address. We see also currently in the COVID-19 crisis that new vaccines have been developed, which is really a good thing, but a lot of those vaccines have temperature issues, and some require a cold chain, an extreme cold chain, which for low and middle income countries, for many low resource settings, it's just not possible. Some of them are even a challenge for some high income countries, even like for ourselves. And also for diagnostics, we see this constant struggle for the countries to access the right type of diagnostics to meet that fits into their context. Then how does this look like in the COVID-19 situation? Well, first of all, my other presenters already mentioned about the testing, but yes, we are talking about testing when some countries are already vaccinating their population. Yes, many of the low and middle income countries, there is argument that there are fewer cases in the COVID-19 in a lot of the low resource settings. And I don't want to bring new theories, I don't want to throw up new theories here, but also part of that, in some countries, it may be perhaps due to the low number of testing that they're able to conduct. And why is there a low number of testing? First of all, it's the access to the diagnostic tools that these countries are facing. A lot of the low resource settings cannot conduct the kind of active testing that countries like South Korea is doing. We have a very robust lab environment. We have a very well-constructed infrastructure where we can actively do PCR tests. But most of the low resource settings, they require a more point-of-care testing, and there are not that many companies that have the point-of-care testing available in their technology. There is a US company that has almost a monopoly in the molecular point-of-care testing market, and they were primarily funded by the public, with the public money to develop a tuberculosis test that meets the context of a lot of the low resource settings. Even with that, a TB test, they are now charging $10 per cartridge, which is actually quite a challenging price, even for a lot of the low-income countries. When we talk to those government officials about what are the barriers to scale up the testing, I'm not talking about COVID, I'm talking about TB, for those tuberculosis tests, there is definitely a strong element of budget for the scale up of testing. Now with the COVID-19, this company has obviously made COVID-19 testing cartridges, but the price they put on this COVID-19 cartridge is $20 per test. And that is for the low and middle income countries. For the high income countries, they're charging much higher, $40, $50. But what is more is, after charging $20 and more for the high income countries, they decided to supply only 10 to 15% of their manufacturing capacity to the low and middle income countries. So what these countries are faced with is they're facing definitely undersupply of the tests available, and also even the test that is being supplied is overly priced for them. So are there cases that are not being detected in those countries that make it look like they don't have a lot of COVID-19? Maybe not, maybe yes, maybe no, but we'll never know until we're able to test them. And then now moving on to vaccines. So we all know this, these figures keep on changing on a daily basis. These are as of late February, so obviously the figures could have changed by now. But then we all know the access to vaccines is a big issue. Over 9 billion doses have already been pre-booked by a lot of the high-income countries. And if you think about the doses that have already been reserved, over 9 billion, and if we think that one person needs to be vaccinated 2 doses, then this is an amount that can already cover over half the world population if it is distributed evenly. But then in this booked doses, the wealthy countries obviously represent 14% of the world population, and they have secured over half of the most promising vaccines that are being developed or that have been approved. That means that some countries will have to wait all the way until 2022 or even later to get their vaccine supplies, while some countries like Canada have already secured over 500% of the vaccines for their population. What is the issue? The issue is not that the high-income countries are vaccinating their population. That is something governments need to do. The health and security of their population is obviously the first interest for any government. But the issue here is, during a pandemic, we are seeing countries that are already starting to vaccinate their low-risk, non-priority groups ahead of the countries that have not even been able to administer a single vaccine to their frontline healthcare providers. Now that is really an issue of injustice. So what makes me uncomfortable sometimes is like how in the media we see people who have just been vaccinated and say, I finally got to go back to my life pre-COVID and sitting in a swimming pool. I'm happy for them, honestly, and I think everyone really has struggled under the COVID-19. Everyone wants to go back to life pre-COVID, but there are definitely priorities. For people for whom vaccination is a matter of life and death issue, I think we are definitely missing a priority when some non-priority people are already being vaccinated. We see from the vaccines that have already been administered, over 3/4 of the vaccination has been made in 10 countries that account for 60% of the global GDP, while over 100 countries have not even been able to administer a single dose as of today. The main issue in all of this is obviously the demand far surpassing the supply. So I want to talk about the supply issue. The supply projection looks a bit like this. So far, the number of vaccines that have been approved for use, 10 vaccines have been approved. And the reported vaccine production capacity for COVID-19 vaccines globally in 2021 is 19 billion doses. While the projection of 10 leading vaccines, the projection of production capacity for the 10 leading vaccines this year is 11 billion. And out of those, the number of doses that have been pre-booked are 10.2 billion. And the number of doses that have been booked by the COVAX facility, which is supposed to supply for a lot of the low and middle income countries, but also South Korea, the vaccines that we are receiving right now are coming from COVAX. And that is only 3.56 billion. What does that mean? That means that 10 leading vaccines can already cover 77% of the global population, but high-income countries that have pre-booked vaccines, they will be the ones who reach a lot of their population far before the other countries, which, if you look at the figures, we see the injustice there. High-income countries, they will probably be reaching 20% of the vaccination coverage by early second quarter of 2021. And by the end of first half of 2021, we expect a lot of them to reach 60 to 70% of their population coverage. Now, that is far more than the priority groups. In the meantime, the 92 COVAX AMC countries, those are a lot of the low-income countries that really need the COVAX assistance to be able to access the vaccines. These countries will probably only reach 3.3% of coverage by the end of first half of 2021. So we see the difference of 3.3% and 60 to 70% coverage during the same time frame. And a lot of these countries that will be only reaching like 3.3% coverage are countries that have actually participated in the clinical trials of a lot of these vaccines. They have participated in the clinical trial, but after the successful development of a vaccine, vaccines are not being supplied to those countries. Or there are also occasions for some countries where the manufacturing site is located within their borders, but the entire amount of the manufacturing is being exported with no doses being shared to the country that is hosting the manufacturing site. So there we do see a problem. Then how can you increase supply? I mean, the fundamental problem of all this is the market dominance of just a few companies that have total control over the supply and the price. Then the best way to tackle this fundamental problem would be to increase the supply and to use the full manufacturing capacity. If you look at the DCVMN, there are 41 manufacturers around the world that have vaccine manufacturing capacity. Separately, whether or not member of the DCVMN, there are also another 41 vaccine manufacturers that have WHO pre-qualified vaccine manufacturing sites. And are they all producing COVID-19 vaccines? No. We need to investigate the full global manufacturing capacity of all these companies, and really try to investigate and see how we can really try to ramp up the supply of vaccines through these manufacturers. And of course, we think the priority should be given to vaccines that are suited to respond to the variants of the virus, because now we see a lot of the mutations occurring, and that excludes a few of the vaccines that are more complicated to change. Some vaccines, for instance, like the mRNA vaccine, might be the ones that are most suitable to meet those variants. But the reality is that not a single mRNA vaccine is currently being produced by manufacturers in low and middle income countries. And then also vaccines that can be kept at a fridge temperature or at least at an easier temperature than the most extreme cases, I think should require a priority. And also if a vaccine can be administered, can be finalized by a single dose, those ones will also need to be prioritized. Then how can we use this full manufacturing capacity that is just idly waiting there to be used? One of the issues that we face, obviously, is the intellectual property barrier. The aim is the intellectual property barrier, a lot of the industries say that's not the issue. But the reality is that during the entire COVID-19 situation, it has been an issue. At the beginning, when there was a shortage of personal protective equipment and masks, some types of masks are patented that countries cannot produce that version of the mask. And they are still under patent, and of course, a lot of the countries had to face shortages of PPEs during the early phase of the COVID-19. And also, we know the case of the remdesivir. Right now, there have been some challenges, there have been some questions raised about the effectiveness of the drug right now. But when remdesivir was seen as probably one of the best effective treatments for COVID-19, this drug was patented in over 70 countries. And they signed restrictive bilateral licensing agreements exclusively with just a few companies, and by that they excluded nearly half of the global population from benefiting of the generic versions of benefiting from the low-cost medicines that they could have received had the license been properly signed. So IP is definitely an issue, and these need to be removed, and for that reason, MSF, along with other civil society, have been demanding at the World Trade Organization so far for the TRIPS waiver during the pandemic to remove the IPs, at least while the pandemic persists, so that countries will have the liberty to produce their own versions of the products if they have the technology, at least without the risk of falling into an IP legal issue. But obviously, removing the IP is not going to solve the entire situation. There needs to be a sharing of knowledge to be able to use the manufacturing capacity, because even with the removal of the IP, you need to know the technology, you need to know the know-how in order to be able to manufacture those vaccines and other products. And tech transfer, what happens after a tech transfer? We looked up in the publicly available information about tech transfer, and the preliminary data has shown that when there was a tech transfer of a COVID-19 vaccine, the manufacturers can typically start delivering the products within the next 6 months. As an example, a company in Argentina received tech transfer for the AstraZeneca vaccines in August, and they had already started producing the vaccines by November. Also, a Swiss company, they received a tech transfer from Moderna. They announced that they got the tech transfer in June. And by November, their vaccines were already being administered in the US. So that is the speed of manufacturing that can happen if tech transfer is made properly. And also, companies can share the know-how with local manufacturers in this process. And one thing that we have always been calling for is to have an open source, an open sharing of technologies in a global platform. There have been many global initiatives such as the CTAP, but they have so far all failed. Well, they have not been as successful as we would have hoped them to be. And a lot of the companies that have the technology and the know-how have not shared their knowledge in these platforms. Now, if this IP removal, tech transfer, and sharing of know-how is done properly, this will significantly help reduce price by eliminating monopolies. It also reduce the impact of, obviously, will reduce the impact of shortage of the supply. And also in the long term, this will build capacity in different regions to also tackle their issues. It will build up the knowledge in these countries that in the future, should there be their needs in their region, they will be able to meet their needs based on the know-how that they have learned from these transfers It's really empowering the countries and the regions that in the long term will be able to tackle their crisis in a more effective way. So what are the key messages? The key message, first of all, to the companies is, first of all, obviously in the short term, supply more to the COVAX. We saw how COVAX has such a shortage of supply. Supply more to the COVAX, to the COVID-19 diagnostic consortium, and also global mechanisms that allow a lot of the low resource settings to access the COVID-19 tools. And then remove the IP barriers so that other countries can scale up manufacturing and also cooperate, including tech transfer. And obviously, products that are made should be sold at cost, as Roxana previously already mentioned. And we also demand for full transparency, especially when there has been public funding involved in the process of the price, the R&D and manufacturing cost of the preclinical and clinical data, landscape of patents and other intellectual properties, and the supply volumes and schedule transparency would be something also very important. Last of all, the key message to governments. As Roxana also mentioned previously, there has been over $10 billion funding, public funding made only to the leading Western vaccines. So what should we do? We should attach strings to public funds for COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. And that also includes South Korea. South Korea is now developing, we already heard that South Korea is developing its own version of COVID-19 vaccines. Should the situation persist, these second-generation vaccines will be game changers. And for continued public funding on these second-generation vaccines, these public strings related to public health and to global health need to be attached. And then also governments that have secured excess vaccines or that have already vaccinated their priority groups should share the supplies with COVAX and also donate to countries that have not been able to even start their vaccination of the priority groups. And also we ask for some of the doses to be shared to the humanitarian buffer because there are populations that are outside the states that states are not protecting. And that really require more attention from the humanitarian actors. And we also ask COVAX to enhance their transparency of price and quantities and their delivery schedules. So to conclude, all this is really about giving the autonomy of countries to empower the countries, to empower the regions, to be able to adapt to their own needs, to build up their knowledge, to be able to meet their needs without having to rely on donation, without having to constantly rely on charity and the moral instinct of other countries, but really being able to work for themselves, to provide for themselves. So we've heard so many times that COVID-19 will not be over until it is over for everyone, and we do sincerely hope that soon it will be over for everyone. Thank you.
예, 앞으로 우리가 어떤 일들을 해야 되는지에 대해서 아주 열정적인 그런 발표를 해주셔서 감사드립니다. Q&A 세션 계속 이제 진행하려고 하는데 이미 이제 이메일로 2명의 그 질문이 들어와 있고요. 일단 먼저 들어온 질문들에서 말씀드리고요. 그 다음에 이후에 플로우에서도 질문할 수 있는 기회를 드리도록 하겠습니다. 첫 번째 질문은 그 김우영님께서 주신 질문인데요. 지금 이 질문은 우리 그 마리안젤라 시마오 우리 WHO 부국장님께 좀 부탁드리려고 합니다. 이 질문은 그러니까 이미 하신의 그 보좌관님께서 얘기하신 부분이기는 한데요. 일단 그 글로벌 제약회사 이미 백신 개발에 성공했고 이미 보급을 하고 있는 그 백신 회사들이 있긴 있는데 이제 개발도상국들에도 그런 백신을 생산할 수 있는 기반이 있는 국가들이 많이 있을 텐데 이제 이 부분에 있어서 그런 백신 개발사들하고 또한 이제 백신 생산 가능한 국가들의 특히 개발도상국의 국가들의 그 회사들을 연결해서 어떻게 하면 효과적으로 그런 이제 저소득 국가들에 대한 백신 공급을 용이하게 할 수 있는지 현재 WHO에서 진행하고 있는 게 어떤 부분들이 있는지 또 앞으로 어떻게 추진하고 있을 것인지에 대해서 대답을 해주시면 좋을 것 같습니다.
Can I come in?
네, 답변해 주십시오.
Yeah, no, thank you, the colleagues, for the very interesting presentation. And as as moderator mentioned, it was partially responded, but not completely. So let me add, because there are different types of considering the timelines of what we need right now. What WHO is working with some partners is assessing what's possible to be done this year in terms of increasing manufacturing capacity. And one of the things that probably the only one thing that can be done this year is to identify, do the matchmaking and increase capacity for fill and finish, right? That there's still some available capacity for fill and finish without disrupting the routine vaccinations, right? Without disrupting what we need the vaccines against measles, polio, and everything to be continue to be produced. So fill and finish is the short term. There are other technologies because we have several technologies. You know, some of them are well known. The inactivated virus. We know more about the virus units, particles, the protein particles. We know much less on the mRNA vaccines, right? And it's estimated that it will take longer. I have not seen the Moderna details of the Moderna to the Swiss. I think it's Novartis who's gonna be doing most likely it's still fill and finish for this mRNA technology because it does require, there's only actually two of the companies who are producing now. One is the biotech, which produces the Pfizer vaccine, right? And then we had the Moderna, and both were small startups, right? So the assessment WHO has at the moment regarding mRNA, there is still a need to increase expertise, number of people who understand how to do it. It's not only, it's part of tech transfer, but it's more than tech transfer. So there are measures that will need to be taken care of at short term, like I mentioned, and to the mid and the long term. Because also when you talk about some of these vaccines, and especially the mRNA, there could be a part of it is preparedness, right? Preparedness for other pandemics as well, because mRNA vaccines, they can produce a large yield in smaller companies. And it can also use small molecules companies, not only biologicals, like most of the other vaccines. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 두 번째 질문은 록사나 보넬 상임고문님께 들어온 질문인데요. 시민들의 역할에 대한 부분에 대한 질문이 있었습니다. 특히 이런 제약회사들이 이제 공적인 자금이 투여된 그래서 백신을 개발하고 했음에도 불구하고 많은 막대한 이익을 얻고 있는 측면에 있어서 시민들은 어떤 노력을 통해서 이런 부분들을 이제 개선해 나갈 것인가? 그러니까 시민의 역할들에 대해서 대답을 해주시면 좋겠습니다.
Thanks for the question. I think that there is an enormous role for civil society. First of all, to monitor where the money is going, how it's being used, and then really push through advocacy the government adding those contracts and conditions that result in products that are affordable and also result in technology being shared, particularly with the Global South. So I think civil society's role is kind of what it always is: monitor, document, push advocacy, and create and document the meaningful stories. Like, what does this mean for people's lives on the ground? This isn't a technical or only a technical discussion. It's about lives. And so I think civil society's role is also to bring those stories up, to remind governments of their responsibilities, to remind companies of their responsibility to the public as well as shareholders. So I don't think it's a different role for civil society. I think it's the same role that civil society often takes And I think civil society just has to apply their experience, their voice, their connections, trust with communities, and keep it up, sustain it. Because as I said at the beginning, these are not problems that came from COVID. These are problems that have existed for many decades. So it's really about sustaining pressure and sustaining attention. Thanks again for the question.
이번에는 그 하신의 그 보좌관님께 질문 들어온 게 있는데요. 일단 첫 번째는 지금 코박스 퍼실리티에 사실 이제 선진국들도 많이 지금 들어와 있고 또한 여러 개도국들도 많이 들어와 있는데 심지어 코박스 퍼실리티에서 공급되는 물량에 있어서도 일부는 이제 그 백신 물량이 조정 문제 때문에 이제 선진국 중심으로 좀 개분이 됐던 측면들이 있는 것 같은데 뭐 그렇게 실제된 건 아니지만 뭐 화이자나 모더나는 이제 유통 채널 문제 때문에도 어쩔 수 없이 돼 있는 부분들이 있는데 그러니까 이런 부분에 있어서 개선점과 관련된 부분에 대한 질문이 하나 들어와 있고요. 두 번째 질문은 백신 개발의 기간이 짧다 보니까 그러니까 시민사회 쪽에서의 그런 백신에 대한 공포감들이 있는 것 또한 백신 접종을 좀 꺼리는 측면들이 있는데 그러니까 이런 측면에 있어서 이런 부분을 개선하기 위한 국제사회 또 시민사회의 노력은 어떻게 진행돼야 되는지 또한 정부 차원의 또한 국제 NGO들의 차원의 노력은 어떻게 해야 되는지 이런 질문 두 가지 들어와 있습니다. 답변 부탁드립니다.
네, 다시 올라와서 답변을 해달라는 요청을 받았습니다. 첫 번째 문제는 그 코박스 부분에 대해서는요. 그 코박스 파실리티를 통한 구매가 있었고 그다음에 코박스 AMC에 들어가는 게 있어요. 그래서 그 AMC 시스템이 이제 그 92개국의 저개발국들에 배분이 되는 시스템이고 그다음에 파실리티를 통한 구매부는 또 별도로 두 개의 다른 시스템으로 진행이 되는 부분이 있거든요. 그래서 코박스 파실리티를 통해서 우리나라는 구매를 한 거고 그다음에 아까 말씀드린 그 AMC가 그 Advanced Market 뭐더라 아무튼 근데 그 AMC를 통해서 이제 저개발국들이 받는 거라 이게 처음부터 들어가는 경로가 달랐기 때문에 그 부분에 대해서 이제 선진국들이 이렇게 받는 거에 대한 개선점이 필요하지 않겠냐라는 지적은 맞는 지적이기도 하지만 동시에 이제 어쨌건 선진국들이 전혀 이 코박스에 참여를 하지 않았더라면은 사실은 이 코박스 자체가 작동을 안 할 수 있는 거거든요. 그리고 가장 어쨌건 현재 문제가 되고 있는 것은 이런 코박스에 참여를 한 국가도 그리고 참여를 하지 않은 국가들이 이거와 별개로 양자 계약을 체결을 하면서 이제 백신들을 먼저 이렇게 선점을 하고 있는 게 결과적으로는 코박스의 문제가 된 거지. 처음에 코박스 자체는 여기 만약에 모든 나라들이 이것을 통해 코박스를 통해서 구매를 했더라면은 훨씬 배분이 공평하게 이루어질 수 있었겠죠. 그래서 의도와 여러 가지 기획이 좋았지만 동시에 이제 나라들의 참여 부분에서 사실은 문제가 많이 발생을 한 거기 때문에 선진국에 먼저 가는 선진국에도 이제 동시에 가는 것 자체를 이제 제가 생각하기에는 그거를 현재 지적을 하기에는 또 어려움이 있지 않을까. 처음부터 그렇게 제도가 만들어졌었던 부분이 있어서 부분 조금 어렵지 않은 현재로서는 좀 개선을 해 가야 되겠죠. 계속 워낙 빠르게 이제 상황이 바뀌어 가니까. 근데 어쨌건 그렇게 시작되었었다는 것을 이제 말씀을 드리고요. 그다음에 백신 기간이 짧다 보니 백신에 대한 공포감이 높은 부분은 그거는 뭐 많은 분들이 이제 지적을 하시는 부분인데 이걸 위해서 일단은 가장 먼저는 기업 쪽에서 할 수 있는 것들 중에 하나가 아까 제가 이제 그 트랜스퍼런시 이야기를 하면서도 이야기를 했는데 초반에 이제 그 모든 임상 자료라든가 이런 것들을 좀 더 투명하게 공개를 할 거를 계속 요구를 했었죠. 근데 그런 임상 자료라든가 이런 것들이 공개가 늦어졌었던 부분들이라든가 내지는 그런 게 확실하게 공개가 되지 않았었던 부분들이 더 공포를 조장하는 면도 있었던 것 같아서 일단은 기업 차원에서는 그런 임상 자료를 보다 투명하게 공개하는 게 좀 중요한 부분일 것 같고 그다음에 이제 그런 거를 규제하는 정부로서는 이제 그런 더 투명한 공개가 이루어질 수 있도록 중요하게 다뤄야 되겠고 그다음에 나머지는 이제 신뢰에 대한 부분인 것 같아요. 그러니까 정말 자국의 이 규제 당국 허가 당국이 모든 임상 자료를 정말 그 정치적인 압력과 무관하게 정말 꼼꼼하게 이것을 모든 안전성과 그 유효성을 다 검증을 할 거라는 것에 대한 신뢰가 있으면은 그러면은 그 부분은 이제 공포를 극복할 수 있는 부분이 아닐까 싶은데 그런 것을 그렇게 정부가 객관적인 데이터를 가지고서 검토를 할 수 있게끔 하는 분위기를 조성을 하는 게 결국에는 이제 시민사회의 역할이 아닐까 생각합니다.
답변 감사드리고요. 일단 현재 그 이메일로 들어온 그 답변에 대해서는 어느 정도 이제 해소가 됐고 시간이 조금 지나서 플로어에서 3분 정도만 질문 받는 걸로 하겠습니다. 혹시 플로어에서 질문 있으시면 예. 김선 이제 사무국장님, 예. 본인 소개 짧게 해주시고 이제 질문해 주시기 바랍니다.
네, 저는 시민건강연구소와 민중건강운동에서 일하고 있는 김선이라고 하는데요. 그 마리안젤라에게 질문하고 싶은데 그 록사나와 신의 발표에서 그 공적 재원 조달의 중요성이나 그리고 이제 전 세계적인 생산 역량의 확대가 중요하다라는 언급이 이제 반복돼서 나왔고 그럼에도 불구하고 전 세계적인 생산 역량의 어떤 그 구체적인 상황에 대해서 이제 구체적인 파악이 필요하고 공적 연구 그 재원 조달 역시도 구체적인 상황이 이제 제대로 파악되어 있지 않다는 얘기를 했었는데 사실 이제 WHO에서 그 엑셀 파일로 정기적으로 업데이트를 해서 그 지금 현재 개발 중인 코로나19 백신 후보 물질에 대해서 굉장히 구체적인 수치들을 이제 보고를 하고 있잖아요. 그러니까 구체적인 사실은 굉장히 공신력 있는 자료들을 가지고 그 자료를 생산하고 있는데 혹시 거기에 몇 가지 칼럼만 추가를 해서 그 각 회사들이 가지고 있는 생산 역량의 규모가 정확히 어느 정도 되는지 그리고 그 각 회사들이 국적이 어디에 있는지 그 각 회사들이 공공기관인지 민간기관인지 공공민간 협력인지 그 세 칼럼만 추가를 해도 사실은 지금 현재 시민사회가 이제 공적으로 가용한 자료들을 막 수집해가지고 DB를 만들고 있는데 그런 노력을 하지 않아도 더 공신력 있는 자료가 될 것 같은데 어떻게 생각하시는지 궁금합니다.
마리안젤라 시마오 부국장님께 부탁드릴까요? 그렇게 마리안젤라 시마오 부국장님께서 이 답변해 주시면 좋겠습니다. 전반적인 전 세계적인 생산 현황에 대한 정보까지 좀 같이 공개되면 좋겠다는 의견이신데요. 예. 나가셨나요? 그러면 남아 계신 분들께 질문 드리겠습니다. 우리 록사나 보낼 그 상임 고문님께서 혹시 이 부분 답변해 주실 수 있는지. 만약에 안 되시면 아니면 하시는 보좌관께서 해주셔야 돼요. 잠깐 연결이 안 되시나요? 하면 안 보신다 그러거든요. 그러면은 그냥 하시는 보좌관님께서 건의를 그렇게 해주시는 WHO 건의를 해주시는 거로 그렇게 하겠습니다. 일단은 코멘트에 가까운 내용이기 때문에요. 일단은 이제 이 내용들은 좀 정리해서 이 운영사무국에서 이 두 분 부국장님하고 상임고문님께 좀 전달을 해주시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 지금까지 경청해 주시고 들어 감사드리고요. 또 발표해 주신 세 분 연자분들께도 감사드립니다. 이거로 이번 세션을 마치겠습니다. 감사합니다.
세 분의 연사님과 사회자로 수고해주신 이재갑 교수님께 감사의 말씀드립니다. 이로써 첫 번째 세션을 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. 곧바로 점심 식사를 위해 이동하겠습니다. 점심 식사는 출구 좌측에 위치한 블룸 비올에서 제공될 예정입니다. 두 번째 세션은 1시 40분에 재개됩니다. 오프라인 참가자 여러분들께서는 안내를 위해 잠시 기다려주시면 감사하겠습니다. 점심 식사 이후 다시 뵙도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.